What we've seen from Trump in the White House is just unreal. The corruption. Sure, he's got 30% of the country that has his back still, but that is a pretty small minority. Taking and weaponizing the formal powers of the state to entrench yourself in office, to profit, to harm your political opponents and silence them. And those are the types of things that I think are most dangerous.
The thing that will undo him if he's not careful is that combination of not caring enough about people's plight, about their, the affordability crisis, while at the same time enriching himself and not making any bones about it. Mr. Trump, watch it.
Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld. I'm Anushka Asthana in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Matt Frei in London. And Anushka, you've had one hell of a week. Are having a hell of a week, aren't you?
Always. I'm always having a hell of a week.
But this one is really, really important, isn't it?
One bit that we're not going to discuss that much, but last night I got back from Atlanta, where I'd been outside the ground talking to relieved England fans. The World Cup carries on for England for a little bit longer. It is totally baking hot here, like it was for you last week. Washington is getting ready to celebrate 250 years of independence, July the 4th, and Donald Trump says he's going to show his prowess through all of it because he's going to speak for a very long time.
On July 4th, it's going to be approximately 107 degrees out. And I'm going to go and I'm going to make a really long speech just to show that I can do anything. It's going to be 107.
He also said he wants to give himself and his two sons the Medal of Honor, which was followed by this slightly weird comment.
He also received that incredible acknowledgement, except for Arthur and Douglas MacArthur. Arthur was his son, Douglas MacArthur, great general. They're the only father and son pair to receive our nation's highest military award for courage above and beyond the call of duty. Now, as I see my two beautiful sons sitting there, I think I'm going to give one to myself, one to them, and we'll have a threesome, okay?
The less said about that, the better. We've had Supreme Court decisions, which we are going to discuss. And then we do need to talk about Donald Trump and the money because, oh my God, the enrichment that is going on is quite something. We found out this week that last year he made $2.2 billion, of which $1.4 billion was in cryptocurrency investments alone. I think we're going to talk about his stock trades later, but just in the first quarter of 2026, 3,600 stock trades, doing quite well in that. He's selling loads of his own personal merch, including $55 hats. And then there's the 20% stake that his family have allegedly taken in a Kazakhstan mining deal. So this week, everyone's talking about Donald Trump's massive personal enrichment, and it seems that quite a lot of voters couldn't care less.
It's astonishing, isn't it? I mean, also, and when you say this week, this is the week in which America will celebrate 250 years since turning its back on the British crown, turning its back on the very system of monarchical abuse of power and self-enrichment that defined the republic from the get-go. For the chief executive of America, Inc., to use the powers of his office and his family and his mates to make this much money, and we'll talk about some of the questionable timing of it a bit later, is quite astonishing. But it does remind me of something, Anushka. So in his first term in office, he made no bones about the fact, but was proud of the fact that he paid barely any tax. And he did pay barely any tax for the amount of money he made, and he did it because he used some very legal loopholes through which to jump in order to avoid paying the tax. And he was really proud of it. Now, imagine a British politician, imagine Keir Starmer, or Nigel Farage for that matter, who's got his own issues with the 5 million quid he was given by a crypto billionaire, making a big point of the fact that he managed to legally cheat the state out of money. It wouldn't wash in this country. But I think it kind of works in America because American citizens, not all of them, but millions of them, most of them Trump voters probably, have a very toxic relationship with government. So if you can somehow circumvent government, and that means circumventing tax, then, that's fine. I think that they think that's rather clever. And in the same way, if you can use your office to make yourself and your family richer, that's probably also okay with lots of people. I think, like so many other things, whether it's gun control, or religion, I think they're just on a different planet to us. Do you think that's right?
Well, I definitely think Donald Trump is like no other. And listening to people around the country talking about him, those who really like him, and let's be clear, the numbers who really love him have reduced, but there's a real stickiness in his support. They just don't see him like other people. So, yeah, they know this stuff is happening, but they just think that he's something different and he's going to, bring something different. Although I do have this sort of sense that allegations of corruption, scandals like these, they kind of don't matter to people until suddenly they matter very much. I actually remember being in the UK in Hartlepool, of all places, when there was a very important by-election not that long ago in our crazy political cycle. And there were loads of questions about Boris Johnson's golden wallpaper in Downing Street. I don't know if you remember it.
Lulu Little was the designer.
Yeah, and I was saying to people, do you care about the wallpaper? And they were like, absolutely not, doesn't make any difference. And actually, he got a massive, massive victory in that by-election. It was a disastrous moment for Keir Starmer. And then I think I was on a television programme talking to an MP, and I said, nobody cared. And the MP said to me, nobody cares until everybody cares. And suddenly it happened with Boris Johnson. Suddenly there was a scandal too many. And as soon as the scandal too many happened, everyone cared about everything, including the wallpaper. I mean, comparing Trump to when you were here and the presidents that you covered, do you think he will have that tipping point? Or do you think there's something about him that's just so different, people forgive it?
I think he will have that tipping point. And I think the thing that will undo him if he's not careful is that combination of not caring enough about people's plight, about their, the affordability crisis, as the Americans call it, having promised to sort it out in his election campaign, while at the same time, enriching himself and not making any bones about it. He's not hiding the fact that he's getting wealthier and wealthier. He thinks that's, a sign of his business genius. It's what clever people do when they're in business, even if they happen to be in government at the same time. And then you will have these very tangible symbols that will be, heroic to some Americans, but utterly reprehensible and corrupt to many, many others, including the triumphant arch that's going to be built, or the massive ballroom that will dwarf the White House, or that, the reflector pond that we've talked about quite a lot in the past. I mean, I think all these images will come together. And I think unless he's really careful, and he doesn't sound like a careful guy at the moment, I think they could undo him. And more importantly, they will undo members of his party who are looking for re-election in what used to be safe congressional seats. And if there's a wipeout for the Republicans in the House, Trump himself may not care because he quite likes the idea of the Democrats back in the House with the majority, because he can then say, I'm a victim. He loves being a victim and a bully at the same time. But I think they will care. And they will turn against him. We talked about this in previous pods. I mean, they really care about some things, and they care when their nose is being rubbed in it. And when they turn against him, then he might well have his Nixon moment. And that's what happened to Nixon. Nixon basically lost his party. They were going to vote against him in the impeachment trial, which was then going to go to the Senate, and he would have lost his job. And so he resigned before that could happen. Mr. Trump, watch it.
We do have this sort of weird split with Donald Trump, which is he has massive power over this particular part of the electorate, which means that in Republican primaries, his people keep winning. So the Republican Party is like, oh, we need to be with him. But also when it actually comes to the midterms later this year, when they need a broader electoral base, they are really worried about how hard it can hit. I mean, everyone knows how critical the midterms are. Donald Trump himself was saying last week, it's absolutely vital that our voters get out there. If not, he said everything that we've done might be undone. I thought it was unbelievable. I don't know if you saw this, where the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he basically sounded like a mob boss when he was saying to a room of, Republican supporters, if the Democrats take control of the House and the Senate, they're going to turn every committee into basically an investigative body that goes after Donald Trump and his family and his friends. And he actually said to you, don't worry, I'm the protection program. I mean, I've never heard anything like this, but I think, as you say, affordability is so important. Just listening to voters a week ago, I remember this guy, Michael, was telling me about working 2 jobs. Middle class. His first job was quite good, but he had to do hours walking around a major supermarket collating online orders until 10:30 at night, on top of a good middle class job, just so that he could take his family out for dinner, just so he could, have the hope of going on holiday. And people like that, I absolutely think, are turning away from Trump. And perhaps for them, that kind of message of, look how much money he's making, might start to really cut through. But that's obviously not the only thing that's going on. Before we get to those midterms, we've had a big week this week, haven't we, when it comes to the Supreme Court and executive power?
Absolutely. Just one, before we get into that, just very briefly, I think the big difference between us in Britain and the Americans is America's, on the whole, always celebrated success and people getting wealthier. Good on you. You bought, that flash car. Fantastic. I think in this country, there's always a little bit of a sense of resentment about people making too much money. I think Trump is testing that optimism about enrichment to its limits, and let's see where that gets us. I think he's probably taken it a bit too far, but that is, I think, a key question for the next few months. So, but it's not just the enrichment; it's also what the Supreme Court, America's highest court, has allowed any president, whether they're called Trump or something else, to get away with going forward. So there was a ruling. There were several rulings on Monday, and one of them, was about the heads of regulatory bodies in America. So, there's various sort of trade commissions, and other bodies. I mean, this could be anything to do with health, public health, with trade, with, the deficit,
Human
whatever.
rights.
Anything apart from the Federal Reserve, the central bank. So in all these bodies, Trump has fired people or tried to fire people. And essentially the Supreme Court has said, you're the chief executive of this country. If you don't like the way someone is regulating something, you can get rid of them. And you can do so without even giving us a reason. You can do it without cause. You can just say, I don't like her, I don't like him, they're gone.
Which unwinds decades-old precedent.
Yes. Actually more than, I think the first time they introduced that was in the 1930s. So it's almost 100 years old. And he's basically said, I don't want this. And the way that the Supreme Court justified it, the majority, and remember, 3 of those justices were appointed by him, was to say, if you want to run the country, you shouldn't be weighed down by these regulatory bodies, because you, as the president, with the power of the people invested in you, you know best. Now, the thing is, this is rather curious, Anushka. They left out one crucial exception, which was the firing of Lisa Cook. She's the African-American member of the board of the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. So Trump tried to get her fired. In fact, he did fire her, although she then didn't move because she was protected by a lower court. He tried to fire her. And the reason they gave officially was that she had essentially fiddled a mortgage statement. She had pretended to had more money than she actually did in order to get a mortgage. And they said, you can't possibly have someone sitting on the Federal Reserve Board that does this. A lower court ruled that was not sufficient cause. She should stay in her job. The Supreme Court, which has just allowed Trump to fire everyone else he feels like firing, has just said you can't do that with Lisa Cook in the Federal Reserve. Now, judicially, why is the Federal Reserve any different to any of these other institutions of oversight? Of course, the reason, which they didn't, I don't think, outlined in the majority, is that the Federal Reserve, is the curator of America's money. If the Federal Reserve is seen to go, belly up or do something according to the whims of a president, that undermines America's economy fundamentally. And indeed, when she was fired by Trump, it had exactly that effect, briefly, on the dollar and treasuries and everything else. We're not safe with this president when he can put his political stamp on the Federal Reserve. They decided to rule that as an exception, which is really interesting. But for all the other things, just really briefly, if you read the minority opinion written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who's a Democrat.
Did you read the minority opinion, Matt?
I read extracts of it. It's not very long, actually. It's about what is it? It's a couple of pages, basically. No, actually, 50 pages for the minority opinion. But the actual stuff that was quoted in the court, which is the bit I heard, that's only 5 minutes long. Now or a transcript of it, and there she said, these rulings handle unbridled power to the executive of the United States, and this is and essentially sidelines the judiciary. I'm paraphrasing. Now, for someone, in this very polite setting of the Supreme Court, to say something as brazen as that, essentially, this guy's trying to behave like a dictator, like a strongman, is quite something. And that's actually, in many ways, that's the most important point, I think, about this week.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, when you put it all together, the amount of power that the executive has seized, the amount of power he has tried to seize through just pushing things through executive orders that a Supreme Court with a majority in his favour has largely gone with is extraordinary. There was one loss for the president this week, the next day in the Supreme Court, worth mentioning. He really, really wanted to get rid of birthright citizenship. That means that if you are born on US soil, you have the right to be a US citizen. He says that it's been abused, that people are coming across the border to have babies so that they can become American citizens. It's really been driven by his deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller. They really wanted to get rid of it. And actually, the Supreme Court stood up to them. Just 2 points I wanted to make on it. The reason they stood up to them is that, you know, it is an unusual thing, birthright citizenship. We don't have it in the UK, but it is so intrinsically linked to America's history of slavery. There was an outrageous decision, I think in 1857, that basically said black people whose ancestors had been brought here by slaves should be not US citizens, but a different class of citizen. And that was overturned in 1868 when they wrote the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which basically said, no, it is soil that matters over blood. If you are born on American soil, then you are an American citizen. And that's why it matters so much to the people who fought against Donald Trump on this. And it's worth just mentioning a very famous right now birthright citizen is a guy called Folarin Balogun. If you've been watching the World Cup, I remember in the first US game against Paraguay, he scored 2 goals. He was their star striker. He scored again yesterday for the US to go through to the final 16, although he's also the subject of great controversy because he got a red card that the entire nation seems to think was unfair. He is the absolute archetype birthright citizen. His mum was a Nigerian Londoner in New York, 7.5 months pregnant. The airline said you can't board. So she gave birth to him in Brooklyn. He was home in London by the age of 1 month. I mean, we could argue him for the England team, no doubt, but he is on the US team because of that. And he will now be banned from a match, but he could be a really key player for them.
I have what they used to call rather pejoratively an anchor baby. My youngest daughter was born in America and therefore is an American citizen. And actually, when this first happened, and we had literally just arrived in the States, and I promise you, there was no intention there. And we were kind of surprised that you have no choice. If you are born in America, you have to be an American citizen, whether you like it or not. You can then renounce your citizenship in your American passport.
As Boris Johnson did.
Exactly. And he did that for tax reasons, because, of course, every American citizen has to pay American tax. I haven't broken that news to her yet. But it's really difficult to renounce it once you've been given it. And it is such an important part of kind of America's DNA that if you are there when you give birth, you have an American child. That, again, it's so interesting. The Supreme Court, does so much of Trump's bidding on so many issues, but on a couple of key issues, whether it's the Federal Reserve and Trump's, ability to fire, and hire people or fire them especially, or whether it's birthright citizenship, they have decided to stick with the precedent. So they kind of know they can push it so far, but not much further. But still, I mean, he's getting most of the rulings in his favor. I think let's not forget about that. Okay, well, good time to bring in our guest this week. He is called Justin Florence. He's the co-founder of Protect Democracy, which is a non-profit, non-partisan organization that does just that. It protects democracy, or at least it tries to. He also worked as a special counsel for President Obama in the White House. And I'm very happy to say that he's going to join us now. So, Justin, it's great to have you on the podcast. This is quite an extraordinary week, isn't it? Because lots of things have coincided. 250th anniversary of you turning your back on a monarchy. The proceedings presided over by someone who sometimes looks as if he wants to be a monarch. You've got the Supreme Court rulings on Monday, and then you've got new information about the extraordinary amounts of money made by Trump, his family, and his associates. Sum it all up for us in a double espresso of meaning.
It really is all coming together. Thank you so much for having me on the show today. I'm excited for this conversation. And, I think I'm worried about as America turned 250 is that we wouldn't be thinking back on our history and would lose that. But I've never felt in my lifetime the Declaration of Independence and the themes of the American Revolution be so prominent, because we are literally confronting what it looks like to have somebody who acts like he wants to rule over us and profit off of us instead of living up to what is supposed to be our founding ideal of a government of the people with a proper system of representation. And so the corruption, some of the rulings from the Supreme Court, which I know we'll get into, and the 250th all kind of come together in this remarkable moment.
One thing we were just discussing here is the contrast between the 250th and the 200th, which was just before I was born. So I don't remember it in real time. But is there a big difference in the way Donald Trump wants to celebrate this 250th moment to what's come in the past?
200th was a little before my time too.
All right, we've got Matt here.
I was a very alert 12-year-old at the time, so I can tell you all about it.
I know my parents went to outside of New York City where the Statue of Liberty is, and there was this big national celebration that was really like grounded in these ideals and liberty and freedom and being a beacon of hope to the world. And it was a truly unifying national celebration. And now it is just all about Trump. And it's kind of mind-boggling because he was handed this golden political opportunity to be in office. He could have used it to bring people together, to lift folks up, to sort of remake what his brand is. And instead it is just, me. How can I profit off of it? How can I make myself look good? How can I rebuild the White House and the buildings around it to be this kind of imperial capital in a way that, fortunately, most of the country is just kind of tuned out. Nobody goes to his state fair on the National Mall. Nobody wants to listen to him speak. But it is a real lost opportunity for the country.
And have you ever had a president before who's tried to reshape what America's about, both in terms of the Constitution, or rather, against the Constitution in terms of his executive power, but also in terms of the physical appearance of the presidency, especially as embodied by the city that is Washington, D.C.? Have you ever had that kind of thing before?
No. And to say more about that, I think there are some folks who have the sense of our founders were these just perfect people who left us this beautiful, complete representative democracy. And of course, that's not the case, right? We had deep flaws at our origins. We had slavery. And the story of America is really one of, over time, the people, our officials in office, our presidents, kind of building towards a more inclusive, a more representative democracy and expanding out those principles. And obviously with, starts and fits and hiccups, we had a civil war, we had an era of Jim Crow, but over time becoming a more complete democracy. And he has kind of taken it and slammed it all in reverse as fast as can be and building toward this monarchic, imperial, autocratic state. And there's a lot of nuance here, right? I worked in the White House for Barack Obama. Presidents of both parties love to have a little bit more power and to be able to use it. So there's some nuance, but the extent and the nature of what he has tried to do in kind of remaking a l'état c'est moi approach is pretty unprecedented.
And can you separate out which parts of these are kind of symbolic, however much people don't like them? Some of the buildings, perhaps, some of the gold in the White House, whatever it might be, and the type of things that are going to irreversibly, possibly change the kind of nature of American democracy?
I think you put your finger on it with some of the examples you would too. To me, you want to decorate the Oval Office in gauche ways, that's fine. You want to redo the White House property. You want to go plaster your name on a bunch of buildings, okay, don't love it. To me, it makes you look small and silly, but presidents are political officials and they can do political things, and they are, head of state, they have some symbolic power. And if you want to, make Air Force One look a certain way and paint colors and whatnot, go for it. What is on the other side is taking and weaponizing the formal powers of the state to entrench yourself in office, to profit, to harm your political opponents and silence them. And those are the types of things that I think are most dangerous and most significant of what we're seeing.
But you could also say that that is what large parts of America voted for. They wanted a businessman, a tycoon in the White House who could take quick decisions, who wasn't going to be tied down like Gulliver by red tape, who's going to be decisive and, would remake the presidency in his own image. Now, I just wonder to what extent, the howl of outrage from many people in America who don't like what he's doing is partly because they don't think it's classy enough. They don't think it's done in good taste. All that fool's gold in the Oval Office is just a bit tacky. Or is it actually that they're worried that, the nature of the republic is being warped beyond recognition? Or maybe a bit of both. What do you think?
I mean, sure, a bit of both, but I think far more people are taking seriously the substance of it. And yeah, the tackiness is good fodder for the late night shows. And sure, there's a group of folks who just hate everything about the man. And so, any paint colors he chooses, any gold he puts up, they're going to hate. But the reason you can tell it's the substance is he's not pleasing the people who put him in office. His popularity is just plummeting. And your question gets to a really good point that, and we see this all over the world, there is a sense that our political systems are broken and are not working and that we need to do things differently and that, regular folks are getting left behind and those with access and the elites are, making billions. I think Trump campaigned in a way that tapped into something real. But he's not saying, okay, I'm going to go now help create a political system that represents people and that gives them a voice and that looks out for their interests. He's saying, I'm going to go, take a weaponized political system for vengeance, for retribution, for profit for myself, and for entrenching myself and my allies in power. And people see that and know it. And, sure, he's got 30% of the country that has his back still, but that is a pretty small minority.
Yeah, you say that, but I he doesn't have to face another election. And
Let
I
us
find,
hope not.
well, obviously he may try, but what I find interesting is if you're sitting in the UK watching what's going on here, and I get messages from people, they think, oh, falling popularity, everyone doesn't like Donald Trump. Absolutely not what you find when you leave a city like Washington, D.C. We just had a focus group done for us by the pollsters Public First in Georgia, in Savannah, and I sat there and I was listening to people speak. They also did a national poll in which it's true, a third of people, when we asked them to score Donald Trump's performance out of 10, gave him a 0. Lots of people think he's terrible, but 1 in 8 give him a 10. And I was sitting in this room and 3 of the women in the room, just a room of 8 people spread across different parties, gave him a 10 out of 10. Another woman gave him an 8 out of 10. And when we were kind of trying to drill into what is it that you so love about him, the thing I found interesting was they knew his flaws. They repeatedly told us what his flaws were, although I have to say his personal enrichment only came up once in an hour and 10 minutes and was hardly discussed at all. But despite his flaws, they love him. And it is kind of extraordinary, is it, that we've never had a politician like this who has this enduring love despite the fact that he's doing all this stuff, which looks absolutely terrible. And that presumably has an impact because it gives him a certain amount of power to put in place what he wants to put in place.
It's true. He is a charismatic guy. Although the way he speaks is in some ways bizarre. And as he has aged, it has gotten less and less coherent. It can be spellbinding and entertaining, and you never know what's going to come out of his mouth. And, he has tapped into this sense we were talking about of things aren't working and the old way isn't cutting it and we need something different. My sense from all of the polling, though, and focus groups that I see is, yes, there are a few people who are still bought in, but more and more feel like this isn't working. And as folks see, he said he was going to tackle inflation and prices keep going up. He said no more foreign wars. He's gotten us into a disastrous one. All these kind of things that he said were what he was going to do for us. It's been, some version of the opposite of that. And so it's not working politically. Now, we should talk more about our upcoming midterm elections. And what my organization has been very focused on is, A lot of presidents, their aspiration is, I'm going to deliver really good policies for the public. I'm going to play smart politics, and I will help my party win the elections. From what we can tell, what Trump is doing is not to be politically popular, it's not to deliver, it's not to actually earn more votes. It is to use all of the powers of his office to try and make it harder for the opposition to compete and to override the ability of folks to have free and fair elections. And so, a real test will be, can he hold on politically even as his and his party's popularity diminishes and diminishes?
And of course, one of the beauties of the American system in the past has always been this division of powers: Congress, executive power, the judiciary. And just tell us about the importance of one of those branches, the judiciary, the Supreme Court specifically this week, which came up with a number of rulings, most of which, as far as I can tell, bolstered the executive powers of any president, whether he's called Trump or something else, whether he's a Republican or a Democrat. And only really in one area, on one vote on Monday, did they roll back some of those powers. And that was on the question of the firing of Lisa Cook, one of the governors on the board of the central bank of the Federal Reserve. So the court seems to be helping him when it comes to, and of course it is a Trump court, he appointed the majority, as it were. They seem to be helping him when it comes to bolstering these executive powers. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there has been a real convergence between Trump's interest in creating this imperial presidency where he wields all power and some views of the majority of the Supreme Court that we need more and more power concentrated in the presidency. So this week, we saw this really landmark decision that overturned almost 100 years of constitutional law in the U.S. And that law was that Congress, which is our representative branch, could create independent agencies that did important work like helping to regulate the economy or protect consumers and investors. And it could do that by making sure that the people who ran those agencies represented both parties, and that the president couldn't just fully control them and fire whoever he wanted. And in a case where my organization and my clients represent the named party, Slaughter versus Trump, so we represented the Federal Trade Commission commissioner who Trump fired.
Rebecca Slaughter, yeah.
Rebecca Slaughter, yeah. The Supreme Court came and said, nope, the president can do whatever he wants here. He can fire whoever he wants, and Congress has, no say in it and no ability to do anything. And that, overturns almost 100 years of precedent and gives into exactly what Trump wants, which is the sense that he alone is the government. He can control it. He can direct it. He can fire who he wants. He can tell people what to do. And so, the Supreme Court really is kind of co-equal partner. Now, this builds on years and years of stuff that we've seen from the Supreme Court majority. A couple of years ago, in a really significant case, they created something that's not in our Constitution, which was immunity for the president to get away with, all kinds of wrongdoing and potential criminal acts without being held accountable. Because they said, well, the president is the head of this branch and he's accountable politically, and, he needs to be immune from any type of enforcement. And you put these things together, and it really is the Donald Trump vision of the presidency as all powerful and unaccountable.
I was just going to ask, how unprecedented is it for a president to do this with the Supreme Court? I mean, every president has had the power to appoint justices. So every president has had the power to try to bend the judiciary to their will. Every president has also had the power to massively enrich themselves and their families personally. How unprecedented is what we're seeing?
So if we look at the Supreme Court, we have 9 justices right now. 3 of them were appointed by Trump, 3 of them by Trump's party, but before he was in office. And some of these moves toward aggrandized and unaccountable presidential power in some ways started from them before Trump and reflect kind of a broader view that he and his allies hold about this. On the corruption, we're seeing it everywhere to some extent. And then what we've seen from Trump in the White House is just unreal on corruption. President Nixon. We were talking about the 200th anniversary. So a little before then, we had President Nixon, who left office in disgrace with various sorts of corruption scandals playing a part of that. But since then, it's been, a real sense that presidents work for the people. They have this public duty and obligation, and they're not there to profit on it. When I worked in the White House, it was super clean, and there was just an absolute sense of we are not here to get perks and gifts and profit. We are here to do the people's work. We're here to uphold a high sort of sense of ethics and patriotism and loyalty. And that's just all out the window with Trump, and it is kind of anything goes. And he said this week, reporting came out, he said, I found out nobody cared if I do all the corruption. So why shouldn't I, is his view. And I don't think that's the case, but it is the approach he's taken.
J.D. Vance came up with a comment that was another jaw dropper this week, didn't he? When he said, while he was launching his book on his Catholic conversion and Catholic morality, he said, the Watergate scandal, if it broke these days, would barely last for a 12-hour news cycle, or in so many words. I mean, he may well be right, because there's so much other alleged corruption that's going on.
But he also added, Matt, that it was crazy it brought down a president. So he added his own personal view to that as well.
Well, there we go. So clearly the moral parameters have changed somewhat. I just want to know, Justin, whether you think the American public is okay with this degree of alleged corruption and self-enrichment.
I don't think they are, but here's my sense of what's happening. Trump, when he first ran for office, his shtick was a little bit like, yeah, it's all corrupt in Washington. It's the swamp. But, one, I'm going to drain the swamp. And two, I'm too rich for it to matter. They can't buy me off. And I think that fed this kind of sense of like, well, everybody's corrupt. The government doesn't work for you. And my worry is that Trump's corruption just continues to feed into a broader public sense of like, well, they're all just corrupt. It's all rigged. None of it's on the level. And that is just disastrous for a democracy, right? People give up hope. They feel like they have no agency. They feel like government is an entity that does stuff to them, not that they're a part of. The question, I think, is can the public, more and more realize that, no, what Trump is doing is just radically different in both profiting off of his office and, from every appearance, the corruption is massively influencing how he approaches the work of government and why government isn't working for people and why it's only instead working for, the folks around him and his friends and allies. And I think the opportunity for the political opposition is to lay out that case that it doesn't have to be like this, that we can have a government that actually is responsive to people and works for people and doesn't just sort of protect concentrated power for political and corporate elites.
Justin, I've heard that accusation from many people, and a number of newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have documented it in great detail. The White House, of course, has responded by saying that Trump is not involved in any of the decisions that allow his sons and other and family friends to make tons of money. He is completely devolved from all that. Justin, the thing that I find so extraordinary is just looking at the sheer number of transactions made by Donald Trump in the year 2025. 22,000 stock transactions, right? Compare that to what Joe Biden did in 4 years. Guess what? It was 13. So I think, obviously there's a lot of time, we have to look into the timing. When did he make those transactions? Did they coincide with big policy announcements? Is there any hint of kind of profiteering there, of some kind of presidential insider trading? These are allegations made by some. None of that's been proven yet. But in itself, the sheer volume of deal making by this president is jaw-dropping.
There's a lot at stake in our midterms. So one of the questions is whether Congress will continue to be beholden to the president and doing everything it can to protect him and kind of keep secrets for him, or whether there is a Congress that uses its independent authority to really understand what's been happening here and dig in on these deals and sort of see, are there quid pro quos? Are there situations where the bribery is leading to a pardon or an antitrust merger being approved or an enforcement investigation being dropped? And so for sure a lot more to learn about what's actually underneath this all.
Justin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Justin.
Thanks for having me on and for all the interesting and important work you guys are doing.
That was Justin Florence, and we obviously mentioned J.D. Vance, the Vice President, in there and his comments on Watergate. I did want to ask you, Matt, about him a little more broadly. He addressed US troops and was mocked heavily on Twitter for a joke where he sort of started by saying, I'm going to be non-partisan, but then the devil on my shoulder basically said to talk about Joe Biden falling down steps. It was like not very nice. And John Favreau, who, to be fair, is a very critical figure of this White House, who worked for Barack Obama, went on X and put a post in, which I thought was quite funny, basically saying J.D. Vance once again proving that he is Donald Trump, drained of charisma. The vice president also made a comment about his Catholic conversion, saying that he hopes the Pope perhaps had learned from him and Marco, by who he means Marco Rubio, and the president, that actually we shouldn't just think about the rights of immigrants, but the rights of Native Americans too. How do you think J.D. Vance is doing right now?
It's a terrible job because you're basically there as the sweeper-upper, of the president. You get to cut ribbons and give a few speeches. Now, the most influential vice president ever was Dick Cheney under George W. Bush. He was the designated adult in the room. And he became a lightning rod for all sorts of things that people didn't like about the Bush presidency. And he had an enormous amount of influence and power at a very delicate time in American politics after 9/11. I think Vance is trying to be, a bit of both things, isn't he? He's trying to be very influential. He's trying to be intellectual. He did write a very good book, The Hillbilly Elegy, and I think probably a better book than the one he's trying to sell at the moment, about his Catholic conversion. But he comes up with ideas, and he's supposed to be seen, I think, by both the White House and the rest of the country and the rest of the world as Trump's intellectual attack dog, as he did famously with President Zelensky in the Oval Office, as he did at the Munich Security Conference. I don't think any of that goes down particularly well. I don't think it endears him to the American public. I don't think Republicans see him as the natural successor to Donald Trump. And and remember, every election is a reaction to what happened before. So after Trump, maybe what even Republicans want is to go to the opposite extreme. Someone who's a bit nicer and kinder, maybe a kind of Marco Rubio figure, a bit of an aging choir boy seems to have sound judgment, less of an attack dog. Don't you think that that's where we're heading, or does J.D. Vance have some secret powers that we haven't yet acknowledged?
I think he's really interesting because he's obviously the kind of ideological driver of stuff. He's clearly like in lockstep with Stephen Miller, who we mentioned, in terms of the anti-immigration messaging, some of which is very popular. But is he as likable is the issue he has. I mentioned earlier the focus group we did in Georgia. Well, at one point we got the Public First moderator to hold up pictures of potential future candidates. And when they held up J.D. Vance, most of the room was silent, and then you get this it's not a very good example, but it was like a sound from a woman.
Okay? You sound as if you're choking on your lunch.
I mean, that's what it sounded like a bit. From a woman, Kim, who loved Donald Trump, really, really loved Donald Trump. Interestingly, she was a veteran as well. She just really didn't like J.D. Vance. Now, pushed on it, we did get a little bit of people saying, yeah, I might vote for JD, I might. Then they moved on to Marco Rubio. I mean, it wasn't overwhelming for him either. And actually, when I spoke to the Public First guys, they said neither of them are very popular. But in the end, the room, I think almost everyone, apart from the most anti-Trump figure there, basically said they could handle Marco Rubio. He was definitely more of a uniting figure, including among people who had voted democratically in the past. I mean, I stood in the room in the White House when he was doing a briefing a while ago, and he's full of charm. He's full of, he's got lots of charisma. But the one thing I would say about him is he's obviously being very, very pro-Trump publicly, but it's very clear from diplomats. He tells a bit of a different story behind the scenes. I do wonder if people see that as a certain level of hypocrisy.
Possibly. I mean, I wouldn't be convinced by either of those two, but I know it's obviously early days. I'll tell you one thing, though, that occurred to me this week. What has Trump got that no other politician has at the moment in America? What he's got, apart from a certain sort of visceral brutality, is an incredible ability when he's having a good day, to have a lot of fun running the world or running the country. And the ability of a politician to beam the fact that he's enjoying himself on his job, I think is massively underestimated, but also very important. There's one other person who has that, and that's Zoran Mamdani. If you can do stuff that's out there, but shows that you're kind of authentic, even if you're kind of inauthentic on occasion, but if you look authentic in the moment and you're having fun, or even if you're being brutal, authenticity, I think, is the most important commodity in politics and arguably the most underrated. And guess who's trying to show that he's got a bit of that on this side of the pond? Andy Burnham. So let's see whether that dressed down, prime ministership works.
Everyone's going wild about these Andy Burnham social media videos, right? Which to me are not that impressive. And you're looking at them and everyone's like, wow, isn't this incredible? And then you compare it to a Zoran Mamdani video. Just go and watch Zoran Mamdani's video where he's talking about the 0.4% chance that people gave to the Knicks and how he would compare that to New Yorkers more generally. And then watch an Andy Burnham video. No offence to Andy Burnham, but look at what's happening over here on this side of the Atlantic in terms of social media. It will blow you away.
No, totally, you're right. And Mamdani is super smart, very, very detailed, actually. So he's got his numbers. It's not woolly stuff, but it's a clear and it's quite an abrasive message. And he delivers it with a smile on his face. And there's a reason why Donald Trump seems to really like Mamdani. And there's a reason why Mamdani quite likes the charisma and the person embodied by Donald Trump, if not his policies. And that is that they're both taking their own parties, to task and shredding the rule book. And it'll be so fascinating to see to what extent that Mamdani thing ends up defining the Democratic Party as something far more left than it is at the moment, or not. Of course, Republicans think, great idea.
I think Donald Trump just thinks that Zoran Mamdani is good looking. On that note, we have to leave it there. That's it for TrumpWorld. Thank you for watching and listening wherever you are doing it. Please, please, please hit subscribe if you are enjoying what you are seeing and hearing.
Take care. See you next time.